delighted today to be speaking with Dr. Jonathan Leeman. Dr. Leeman is the Editorial Director for 9 Marks, an organization that produces church leadership resources in Washington, D.C. He is the author of The Church and the Surprising Offenses of God's Love, Church Membership, How the World Knows Who Represents Jesus. He is also the author of the text that we'll be discussing today, Political Church, the Local Assembly as Embassy of Christ's Rule. We're delighted to be speaking with you today, Dr. Leeman.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Dr. Leeman, as we begin, I'd like to state your thesis for our viewers, and that is this, that the church is an inherently political institution. And I'll quote from page 40, quote, "My hope is to present a case for the political nature of the church using a theological methodology that individuals and churches within my own evangelical tradition would find compelling, specifically a theological method driven by the biblical covenants." Dr. Leeman, what is it that you mean exactly when you use the word political?
Yeah, the idea of political is just under God's rule, under a ruling, or let's just say a body politic that's bound together by kingship, right? And in the Western tradition, since at least the 17th century, we've tended to separate the political off from other areas of life. So you have the political realm, you have the religious realm, and I'm saying that's not accurate. All of life is under the rule of God, and I'm not the first to make that argument. I'm building very much on the arguments of others. A specific definition I give for political in the book is mediating of God's covenants. So the institutions that mediate God's rule through the covenant. I'm sorry, the covenantal institutions that mediate God's rule.
Dr. Leeman, how does this concept of politics and your research into political theology, how does that affect your day-to-day work in, for example, 9 Marks?
Yeah, sure. Well, 9 Marks is a ministry dedicated to equipping church leaders with a biblical vision and practical resources for building healthy churches. That's what we do. And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit, one of the things that I particularly work on is questions of church government and church structure and what it is that distinguishes your individual Christian life from what it means to be a member of the church. So, Jonathan, you and I aren't members of the same church, but I trust we're both members of different churches. What does that mean for our relationship in Christ? And is there something different about my relationship with other members of my church than my relationship with you? Right? So these are the sort of things I think about and talk about with 9 Marks and other matters as well. But it very much, it impinges on the same domain of conversation. How are our lives structured together? How are our lives bound together in groups, in societies? What's the relationship between church and state? So my daily work in talking to pastors does very much impinge in some ways on this same conversation that I'm dealing with in the book.
Is one's political theology, or one's understanding of how the church relates to politics in this broad sense, is this a matter of opinion, or is this a matter where we can have a theological definiteness to this conversation?
Yeah, well, in some ways, Christians have been talking about political theology at least since Augustine, if not before. It's sort of come into its own as a specialized field in Christian circles, a specialized academic field called political theology in Christian circles in the last 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how you measure it or who you look to as the starting point. Well, basically, what is political theology? Well, it's a theology of, I don't want to say just politics as in government, the way people would understand that today. It's a theology of the entire political domain and reality within which we live, okay, including church, including state, and so forth. And so, there's a variety of views among Christians about the right way, the wrong way to put these things together, just as you're going to have a variety of views in any other discipline.
Dr. Leeman, with your concept of political theology in place, this theology of politics, let me ask, is it possible and advisable for Christians to remain politically neutral, perhaps in times of war or social unrest? Is that a possibility?
I don't think it's a possibility. I think no matter where you're standing, you're taking some view, right? You're saying that as a Christian, if your first allegiance is to God and in Christ, you're saying God, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, has a certain demand on my life. And that's that I not get involved, say, in this particular war, or not get involved in this particular action, whatever that is. So, we use the language of neutrality, and so there is a place for neutrality, but recognize that where you're standing isn't neutral. It's driven by a certain conviction and a certain sense of what you must do to be obedient. To be obedient, that is to submit to King Jesus, I need to stand here where I'm standing. Now, when I say we can't surrender the idea of neutrality at all, what I would say is this. There are certain God gives a different authority to different institutions. So he gives one authority to the state, one authority to the church. And outside of an institution's authorization, so, can your pastor recommend which dentist you should go to? Well, no, he's not been authorized. Your pastor's not been authorized to tell you which dentist to go to. So there's a sense in which your pastor should be neutral outside of his jurisdiction, namely which dentist you should go to. So yeah, there is a time and a place for neutrality, and the time and place for that is places where we've not been authorized by King Jesus. Nonetheless, in something like war, well, you're necessarily involved in that question.
How is it, Dr. Leeman, that you began this study? What was the seminal idea that led you to the conclusion, I need to write a book about this?
Well, in many ways, it's the culmination of my 2 master's degree. I did 1 master's degree in theology and 1 master's degree in political theory. And so then when I began to do my PhD, those things just both kind of reached in like vines and took control of it without so much conscious intentionality. Where it did begin is before I was writing a book on church membership. It's one of the first ones you named there, Church and the Surprising Offense of God's Love. And that in many ways got my thinking working. And what does it mean to be a member? What are the keys of the kingdom? What does it mean to be bound and loosed on earth? Is it bound and loosed in heaven? And a lot of the reflections in political church grew out of that.
Very good. Very good. Dr. Leeman, the heart of the book, or the bulk of the book, represents a theological study of the biblical covenants. When did you come to the realization that the biblical covenants reveal the political nature of the church?
Yeah, sure. I mean, several other authors were extremely helpful in that. Steve Wellum and Peter Gentry in their book Kingdom Through Covenant. Well, there it is. There's the heart of the idea, right? Kingdom is established through covenant. Kingdom Through Covenant is the title of the book. Greg Beale's work was very helpful. One political theorist, or political theologian, I should say in particular, Oliver O'Donovan, was extremely helpful in my thinking. He was the one who helped me realize, he has this line in one of his books in which he says, when the Old Testament Jew said Yahweh is king, it was very much a political claim, and I was thinking about that. And yet Jesus is Lord, that also is a political claim. And Oliver O'Donovan was the one who really helped me understand that, okay, these are 2 domains that, religion and politics, are very much overlapping domains entirely. Everything that you do religious is political, and everything you do political has a religious set of assumptions behind it. So stop and think for a moment. If you're making a claim in the public square over, well, the obvious issues like abortion or homosexual marriage or same-sex marriage or, things like that, but also any other issue, flat tax versus progressive tax, environmental policy, federal funding for national parks, all of these positions that you will hold in political positions, so-called, in the public square, will have a set of assumptions, worldview and moral assumptions behind them. You will have a set of assumptions about what man is, who God is, what justice is, that inform your political positions, right? And so what's behind those moral assumptions? Well, they're worldview religious assumptions. In other words, you can't go into the public square without some set of assumptions informing what you think about God. I'm sorry, what you think about your political positions. And And in that sense, at one point in the book, I described the public square as nothing more or less than a battleground of gods. Each person goes into the public square to defend his or her god or gods, right? Big G, small g, whatever. The atheist no less than the Christian or the Muslim or the Hindu or whatever, right? So it's some of these ideas that really began to impress themselves on me, in part through the study of the covenants. What you have in the common covenants is God's claiming all humanity as his jurisdiction. And then you have a delay of his final judgment, right? With Genesis 9 and the Noahic covenant, you essentially have the introduction of eschatology to the Bible, because God says he's going to delay his judgment till the end. No longer through water, he says, rainbow and so forth. I'm going to put down my bow of war. But then you have the creation of these special covenants. And what do? Well, the special covenants, they're calling out, among other things, they're calling out a special people and holding them up as an example of what he intends for all humanity. So, hey, humanity, I want you to look like these covenant, you're called to live like these special covenant people, right? I could get into the text if you wanted to, but that's the gist, among other things. And but his jurisdiction remains over all humanity. So one of the biblical exegetical things I struggled with is, okay, how do we understand the language of God's kingdom? Because Christ talks about his coming kingdom, or the manifestation of his kingdom. But wait a second, isn't God always in charge? Does he not always rule? Well, in fact, what the coming of his kingdom is the manifestation, the displaying, a word I make up, visibilization, becoming visible of his kingdom. But he's always in charge. He's in charge over Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib. Name your non-Israel kings. God's clearly and demonstrates clearly. Cyrus, he's clearly in charge over all of them. And what we get with the coming of Christ is the presentation, the manifestation of God's kingship, right? Okay, so now what we're trying to do is, the covenants are helping us to understand, okay, what is politics then? What is the quote-unquote political in all of this? And, well, yeah, I'm going off on lots of tangents here, but that's the burden of the book, is to look at what the Bible says and how the storyline through these covenantal structures develops in order to give us a better, more profound understanding of what is political, what is politics. What you have in the liberal tradition of Hobbes and Locke and Jefferson and so forth, is a dividing of politics away from the religious. Now, we understand why people did that for the sake of the religious wars and so forth, and trying to say, hey, let's agree to disagree on some of these religious matters. You get that. But what's also going on? What's going on is a power move. Because if I can take your religious views and sort of sequester them over here, put them over here, then they don't have to bother me. And I can let my religious views, I'm not going to call them that, I'm going to call them something else. I'm going to call them, let's say, public reason. I can take those and I can rule, right? Because, hey, those views of you, those are religious. We don't need those here. You see, what's going on is a power play. So it's the power holders of any given generation which decide what's religious, what's not religious, right? That in itself is a political move. What counts as religion? Well, that's because everything is religious. One sense.
Dr. Leeman, I really appreciate that deep reflection. Thank you so much for that. When we're speaking of a local church, what exactly are we speaking about?
Well, I mean, local church, as it's been defined, at least since the Protestant Reformation, is a congregation of Christians coming together for the preaching of the gospel and the celebration of the ordinances. That would be your basic Protestant definition. So, congregation of Christians, preaching of the gospel, celebrating of the ordinances. That's what marks off a local church as a local church.
Your subtitle, The Local Assembly as Embassy of Christ's Rule. Why do you focus on the local assembly as opposed to simply the church, the universal church?
Yeah, church, sure, great question. Well, it's the local assembly where the church on earth becomes visible, or where the universal church becomes visible, right? It's in that place where the keys of the keys are exercised through the preaching of the gospel and through the celebration of the ordinances, that somebody becomes identified as a Christian, as a member of the local church. So think about it in a big picture sense like this. How did the nations know who is Israel? How do we know who God's people are in the Old Testament? Well, it's those who receive circumcision and celebrate the Sabbath and eventually are there in the land. And so the kingdom of Israel was identified with those covenantal signs and their life together in the land of Canaan, right? Well, how do we know who the people of God are in the New Testament? How do we know? Think about the new covenant promises of God's Spirit coming and indwelling us. Well, that's all invisible. How do an invisible people become visible? Or put it like this: how do you exercise border patrol in a kingdom with no borders? Answer: the local church. Answer: through our inclusion in these congregations of marked off, baptized, Lord's Supper receiving members of local churches. So so you mentioned my book earlier, Church Membership. The subtitle of that is How the World Knows Who Represents Jesus, where there's that idea of the church becoming visible. Mm-hmm. So a lot of Christians these days, well, some Christians these days say what no Christians used to say, which is, yeah, I can be a Christian, but not really a part of a local church. Well, not in the Bible, you can't. And second of all, how does anybody know you're a Christian? I mean, what you are is the captain over your own ship. What you are is a free agent. What you are is somebody who's just going around kind of defining Christianity and defining the gospel for yourself. And that's clearly not the way Jesus intended it. What he intended is people to be baptized and join to local churches. So you think about the people who say to Peter, what must we do to be saved? And he says, repent and be baptized. And it says, and 3,000 were baptized that number. 3,000 were baptized that day and added to their number. Well, what number? Well, membership in the church in Jerusalem, right? That was just how it worked in the New Testament. So yeah, the local church is crucial for identifying ourselves and identifying others as believers, so that the nations would know to who to look to where to find the Jesus flag, right? Who represents Jesus. And it also keeps us accountable within the faith. And that's why I think there needs to be healthy practices of church membership and church discipline and so forth.
Dr. Leeman, I, as an evangelical, appreciate your distinction there of visible and invisible church, something that's been drawn since the Reformation. But how would you respond to a Christian representing a broader ecclesiology, perhaps a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox, that says that your argument needs to push forward to a church structure larger than single congregations? We need a magisterium, as it were. How would you respond?
Yeah, sure. I mean, since the Reformation, Roman Catholic popes, for instance, have accused Protestantism of fomenting division. And then I forget, you're the church historian, you can remember better than I can, the pope who claimed that it was going to break into 1,000 pieces, the church would in light of Martin Luther's move. So where say speaking as a Congregationalist, where I'm going to overlap with my Presbyterian church structure, brothers and sisters, and my Episcopal small e church structure, brothers and sisters. And by Episcopal, I don't mean the Episcopal Church as a denomination. I mean as a church structure in which you have bishops and synods and so forth. So that's Roman Catholic, Methodist, Lutheran, Anglican, right? What I would say to people who belong to those different traditions is, on the one hand, we agree. There needs to be a visible church, and there needs to be some recognized authority for who can affirm who the believers are, who the believers aren't. That is, can receive baptism and the Lord's Supper, and who can't. So in that sense, every single Christian tradition is going to agree. And the thesis of my book, in a sense, you can belong to any one of those and embrace the thesis of my book, that whoever has the keys of the kingdom marks off who the people of God are as the model political society to which all the nations should look and both be convicted and called, right, by the model political society of the church. So again, whether you're coming from a small e Episcopal, bishop, synods, all the way down to local churches, tradition, or you're coming from a congregational, we have these different, embassies of Christ's rule. I think you can embrace the thesis of the book. The difference is going to lie with, okay, who holds the keys? Does the bishop hold the key? Does the presbytery? Do the individual congregations hold the keys? And yeah, that's where there's going to be exegetical differences between us, and that's where, hey, I'm going to lean against quote unquote connectionalist church polities. That is where churches are connected by presbyteries or connected by bishops. I'm going to lean into them and say, hey, look, you're undermining the priest-king role and rule of all the saints. So I'm going to have certain critiques of those traditions, and they're going to have certain critiques of my Congregationalist tradition. They're going to say, yeah, you're fomenting individualism and ultimately anarchy of a kind. That's why you have all this denominational division. So yeah, we're going to both have arguments against the other that we use to push against one another. Nonetheless, I want to maintain, I think every Christian, at least for this our conversation, every Christian tradition can maintain the overall thesis of the book, which is the church, whether governed by congregations or governed by bishops, is a distinct, marked-off political society, and that gets lived out in the context of local congregations. So the small e Episcopalian and the small p Presbyterian can all affirm that. The life of the church, we live these things out.
Very grateful for that clarification. Thank you, Dr. Leeman. Dr. Leeman, how does your thesis reflect on the concept of religious freedom?
Yeah, sure. Well, it depends on what's your starting point. The big question is, what's your starting point for grounding religious freedom? And in the Western democratic tradition, we've tended to argue for religious freedom based on the free conscience, right? So, okay, hey, look, I believe in God, you don't believe in God. So, okay, how can I convince you to respect my religion? Hey, I got it. You don't want your conscience to be molested. I don't want my conscience to be... We can agree, can't we, across religious and non-religious, quote-unquote, boundaries that we don't want our consciences to be molested or imposed upon, right? Okay, let's make the free conscience the foundation of religious freedom, right? Because we all agree on that, even if we don't agree on who God is, or is there even a God? Thomas Jefferson. I don't care if my neighbor has one God, 3 gods, or 20 gods. So the free conscience becomes the foundation of religious freedom. Well, okay, that works for a while. That works when everybody is basically more or less Judeo-Christian in their ethics. But what happens when our set of your sort of Judeo-Christian ethics are working as you might call a quote-unquote backstop? But what happens when that backstop goes away and those shared Judeo-Christian values go away? God is not a part of the contract. The contract is our agreement to leave God out of it and respect one another's consciences. So there is no religious backdrop. And so once those kind of shared Judeo-religious assumptions and values go away, suddenly, hey, look, I want to abort my baby. You should respect my conscience. And that's actually the language that 1992 Planned Parenthood versus Casey uses. The majority of paper ruling says men and women of good conscience can disagree, and that we all what's the famous line from that ruling? Right to define our own concept of existence, or something like that. What is that? What is the right to define our own concept of existence? Well, that's the free conscience. That's precisely what that is. Okay, so now the free conscience is justifying abortion. And what do all the same-sex marriage rulings build on? Well, they build on exactly that same language. Later hearings or later court decisions draw on that same Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision-making to uphold same-sex marriage. Okay, so now the free conscience is justifying abortion, same-sex marriage. Is that what the original architects of religious freedom have in mind? Well, not at all. Of course not. But essentially what you have is sexual freedom is religious freedom. Religious freedom is the freedom to abort your baby. Now nobody's talking that way. I do in my book, but that's essentially the foundation of the argument. So we as Christians got to think, okay, well, is that what religious freedom is in the Bible? And I would say, well, no, I do believe in religious freedom. I would actually use the language of religious tolerance, and I think we need to build it on better, different foundations, and those are these. In Genesis 9, God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. In other words, if you harm a man, I am authorized by God, humanity is authorized by God to prosecute, criminalize your activity. Vern Poythress makes the point. But notice that nowhere are crimes against God, blasphemy, false religion, false worship, nowhere is humanity authorized to prosecute those. Now, they do in the life of Israel. That's a distinct, marked-off society in Israel. But humanity broadly, at no point is authorized to prosecute false religion. We're only authorized to prosecute crimes in which another human being is harmed. That's kind of your burden of proof. Okay, if you could prove something hurts people, then God says, yeah, punish it, right? So I would say our concept of religious freedom or better religious tolerance comes from just the fact that we don't have the authority to do otherwise. You can say, praise Allah, or you can say, do whatever you're going to do in your religion. I as a human being have not been given authority by God to stop you from doing that. You see. Now, as new Christians, we also understand how the new covenant works, that it works by faith and not by the coercive power of the sword. So not only am I not authorized, I'm not competent, I'm not able to make you worship rightly, right? So it would just be a futile exercise anyway. Okay, so coming from a Christian standpoint, and then I guess the last thing I would say about religious freedom or religious tolerance, why we need it, is that it's the church that's called off to mark off the who and the what of the gospel. What is the gospel? What's the right confession? Who are the gospel people? Who are your church members? So it's the church that has that authority, not the state. Okay, so we're not been authorized, we're not competent, and it's the church's job, not the state's job, to mark off right confessions, right confessors. Right? So back to a matter of jurisdiction, as we were talking about much earlier in the conversation. So for all of these reasons, I think Christians should be the strongest proponents of religious freedom / religious tolerance. Now here's the deal, Jonathan. Because we have a doctrine of the church, and because we don't think we're authorized to impose our religious views on others, we are actually kind of unique. Secular progressivism, for instance, has no doctrine of the church. And it has no sense of, I'm not authorized to do that. So what are they going to do? They're going to impose their quote-unquote religious views. They are going to impose their small g gods on others. And that's precisely what we see happening in the public square right now in all these religious freedom cases. You have secular progressivism saying, to be a citizen in this society, you can't discriminate in those ways, or you must you must subsidize these abortions. They are very much in the business of imposing their religious views on us. I would say kind of pagan religious views on us. So it's actually the Christian who is the only one with sufficient and fair grounds for religious freedom / religious tolerance. And that's the mess I think we find ourselves in right now in all of these court cases and the public square generally that we describe as the culture wars.
Dr. Leeman, thank you so much for that very insightful set of ideas and response. Thank you. If I can close with a question that we've been asking all of the interviewees on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize this unity, and what can Christians do to pursue the unity of the church? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I think people tend to think about unity in one of several ways. We can talk about the unity of the institution, and so that's the general impulse that you'll often hear coming out of, say, Roman churches and other high church, Episcopalian and Anglican and so forth churches. And to some extent Presbyterian churches. It's an institutional unity that we need. So when Jesus says, Father, may they be one as we are one, is that what it's talking about? Is it talking about an institutional unity? We can talk about a doctrinal unity, that though we are not formally united under a certain structure, we do maintain some level of doctrinal unity. It's not enforced, but we're all appealing to the same gospel. Think of the conference Together for the Gospel, right? They're appealing to some level, Together for the Gospel, of doctrinal unity, albeit outside of formal institutional structures. And then a third way we might think of unity is just a unity of life, and this is going to be kind of vague, affirmation and work and pursuit of the mission together in some sense. I think you see this represented, for instance, in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where these churches are helping to support these other churches, or the church in Antioch, for instance, is sending money to the church in Jerusalem, or you think of John's epistles where he's talking about, these missionaries coming out and giving support to them, and whereas, this other church leader wasn't giving support to the good missionaries being sent through. What do you have? You sort of a unity of mission going on among the churches. Now, as a Congregationalist, I see no place in the Bible, not even Acts 15, we could talk about that if you want, no place in the Bible calling for either a global or even a regional sense of formal, authority-driven institutional unity. And I don't think it's that formal, authority-driven institutional unity between churches that non-Christians are looking at and saying, oh, wow, those are Jesus' disciples. Well, no, Jesus says it's by our love for one another that they will know you are my disciples, right? It's not the fact that denominational headquarters rules over all of us in some sense, or the presbytery rather. Okay, so I don't think the unity ultimately that we're looking for is this. I do think it's in this second and this third category. I think we want to grow in unity of doctrine, and I think we want to grow in unity of mission. And so there, I think what's unfortunate is how turfy so many and competitive so many evangelical churches can be with one another, right? Trying to grow their church as big as they can and not looking for ways to sponsor church plants or revitalization projects or help out other churches. The picture we have in the New Testament between, again, say the church in Antioch and Jerusalem is a working things out and working to help one another, right? And I would love to see, and by God's grace, I'm enjoying seeing more and more churches capture this vision of supporting and working to help one another financially, sending preachers, sending members sometimes in some circumstances, working together on doctrinal issues, not in an authoritative way, working to sponsor missionaries or seminary students together. So all of this third category, unity of mission, I see more and more of, and that's super encouraging to me. So I would say you want to keep authority located in the local assembly. Again, that's a whole other conversation. But as we do that, as these discrete embassies of Christ, let's also work together in unity of doctrine and unity of mission.
It's been our honor today to be speaking with Dr. Jonathan Leeman, Editorial Director for 9 Marks, and also author of the text that we've been discussing, Political Church, the Local Assembly as Embassy of Christ's Rule. Dr. Leeman, thank you very much for this lively and very beneficial conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan.